Everyone froze in the church as I calmly stood up, right before the I do. My daughter, in her white gown, had just slipped me a desperate note from her bouquet. Dad, he's a monster. Save me! Her fiancé, the man I'd ignored when he obsessively asked about our house on the lake, turned pale. He thought he had won. He was wrong. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Winfred Harris. I'm 64 years old, and I live in what most people would call paradise, a lakeside home at 1176 Lakeshore Boulevard in Lake Tahoe, California. I spent 40 years building architectural firms from the ground up, designing everything from modest family homes to commercial towers. Retirement should have been my golden years. Instead, it became the stage for the most terrifying performance of my life. Let me tell you about my daughter, Sarah, 29 years old, brilliant graphic designer, and the absolute light of my world. 6 months ago, she met Chris Parker at some tech networking event in Sacramento. Within 2 weeks, she was calling him the one. Within a month, he'd moved into her apartment in South Lake Tahoe. Within 3 months, they were engaged. Chris seemed perfect on paper. 36 years old, supposedly an investment consultant, charming smile, well-dressed, impeccable manners, the kind of man who holds doors, remembers birthdays, and knows exactly what wine pairs with salmon. Sarah was radiant around him. I wanted to be happy for her. I really did, but something bothered me. It started small. The first time Chris visited my house, our family home with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the crystal blue lake, he asked about the property value. Not unusual, perhaps. Young couples think about these things. But then he asked who was listed on the deed, whether I had a will, what my estate planning looked like. Just curious, he'd said with that practiced smile. Sarah and I are planning our future, want to understand the family's financial landscape. I brushed it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe modern relationships really did involve this level of financial transparency. Sarah seemed unbothered by his questions, so I kept my mouth shut. The wedding was set for June 14th at St. Mary's Church. Sarah was handling most of the planning. She'd always been organized that way. But Chris inserted himself into every decision. The venue, the catering, the guest list. He even had opinions about the flower arrangements. I chalked it up to him being an involved partner. Then came the family dinners. We'd gather every Sunday at my place. Sarah would help me cook. She'd inherited her mother's talent for pasta, while Chris would wander around the house. He'd comment on the architecture, which made sense given my profession, but his comments weren't about aesthetics. They were about structure, foundation, property lines, square footage. This place must be worth, what, $2.8 million? He asked one evening, running his hand along the custom walnut cabinets I'd designed myself. Thereabouts, I replied, watching him carefully. And it's all in your name? No mortgage? Paid off 15 years ago. He nodded slowly, that calculating look flickering across his face before the smile returned. You've built something incredible here, Winfred. Really incredible. The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he was already measuring for new furniture. But the moment that truly set off alarm bells came 3 weeks before the wedding. We were finishing dinner, roasted chicken, Sarah's favorite, when Chris leaned back in his chair and said, I've been thinking about logistics. After the honeymoon, when Sarah and I move in here. Move in here? I interrupted. Sarah looked confused. Chris, we never discussed. Oh, I just assumed, he said smoothly. I mean, this house is enormous. 4 bedrooms, and you're here alone. It makes financial sense. We could save money, and you'd have family close by. Win-win, right? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. We had absolutely never discussed them living here. Not once. Yet Chris spoke with such confidence, as if it were already decided, as if my home were already his. Sarah glanced between us, uncertain. We should probably talk about this later, Chris. Of course, sweetheart. Just thinking ahead. He reached over and squeezed her hand, but his eyes were on me, measuring, calculating. That night, after they left, I stood on my deck overlooking the lake. The water was black glass under the moonlight, pine trees silhouetted against the stars. I designed this house with my bare hands 30 years ago. Every beam, every window, Every carefully planned sightline, it was my masterpiece, and Chris Parker was already planning how to take it. I poured myself 2 fingers of scotch and watched the darkness. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just tactless. Maybe I was a paranoid old man who couldn't let his daughter grow up. But then I remembered the way he'd looked at my house. Not with admiration, with ownership. The wedding was 3 weeks away. Sarah was glowing with happiness, completely oblivious to the predator she'd invited into her life. And I was standing there with nothing but a gut feeling and a growing sense of dread. I thought about my late wife, Catherine. She'd always trusted her instincts about people. Listen to what they don't say, Win, she'd told me. That's where the truth lives. Chris Parker said all the right things, but what he wasn't saying was screaming at me. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to figure out if I was crazy or if my daughter was engaged to something far worse than a gold digger. I finished my scotch and went inside. Sleep wouldn't come easy that night. The phone call happened 2 days later. I was in my home office reviewing some old architectural plans, a habit I'd maintained in retirement, when I heard voices from the guest room downstairs. Chris had stayed over after dinner with Sarah, claiming his apartment was having plumbing issues. Sarah had already left for work. I should have announced myself. Basic courtesy. But something made me pause at the top of the stairs. Chris's voice drifted up, casual and confident. Yeah, the plan's working perfectly. The old man's completely trusting. Daughter's head over heels. By the end of the year, everything will be mine. I froze. No, he doesn't suspect a thing, Chris continued. These retired types are all the same. Lonely, eager to please, desperate to keep their kids close. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him once Sarah and I are married. The house, the accounts, everything. My hand gripped the railing. Every instinct in my body screamed to charge down those stairs and throw him out. But I didn't move. Trust me, Chris said, laughing. I've done this before. It's foolproof. The call ended. I heard him moving around downstairs, probably making coffee in my kitchen like he owned the place. I quietly walked back to my office and closed the door. My hands were shaking. Not with fear, with rage. But rage wouldn't help Sarah. Confronting Chris directly would only tip him off, and he'd disappear, probably taking Sarah with him. I needed to be smarter than that. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. 2 hours later, I had an appointment with Richard Cole, a private investigator a former colleague had recommended years ago. Cole had been FBI before going private. If Chris Parker had done this before, there would be a trail. The next morning, I met Cole at a coffee shop in South Lake Tahoe, far from anywhere Sarah or Chris might see us. Cole was in his early 50s, gray hair, sharp eyes, the kind of man who noticed everything. I told him about Chris, about the questions, the presumptions, the overheard phone call. Cole listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When I finished, he nodded slowly. I'll need 2 weeks for a thorough background check. Social security, employment history, criminal records, civil suits, the works. If there's something to find, I'll find it. How much? $5,000 retainer, plus expenses. I wrote the check without hesitation. Meanwhile, at home, everything became more complicated. Sarah had been spending more time at my place, and I noticed changes in her. She was jumpier, more withdrawn. The vibrant woman who used to fill the house with laughter now seemed muted, as if someone had turned down her volume. One evening I tried to talk to her. We were alone in the kitchen. Chris had stepped out to take a call. Sarah, honey, are you happy? She looked up, startled. Of course, Dad. Why would you ask that? You seem different lately. Stressed. Her face closed off immediately. I'm fine. Just wedding nerves, that's all. If you ever want to talk... Dad, stop. Her voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. I know what you're doing. You don't like Chris. You think he's not good enough for me, but I'm an adult, and I'm making my own choices. That's not what I... You just don't want to let me go? Her eyes were suddenly bright with tears. Ever since Mom died, you've been so... clingy. But I can't stay your little girl forever, Dad. I have my own life. Chris appeared in the doorway then, concern painted across his face. Everything okay in here? Sarah brushed past me. Fine. Let's go, Chris. I need some air. They left. I stood alone in my kitchen, the words cutting deeper than any knife. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Sarah's accusation. Was she right? Was I just a paranoid father who couldn't accept his daughter growing up? But then I remembered Chris's phone call. I've done this before. No, this wasn't about me being controlling. This was about something much darker. I found myself pulling out old photo albums. Sarah at 5 years old, missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera. Sarah at 12, awkward and beautiful on her first day of middle school. Sarah at 18, heading off to college, hugging me goodbye. When had I lost her? Not gradually. That's what terrified me. The change had been sudden, like someone had thrown a switch. 6 months ago, she was calling me 3 times a week, visiting every Sunday, sharing her life with me. Now she could barely look me in the eye. That's what abusers do, I realized. They isolate. They turn their victims against everyone who might see the truth. Chris Parker was good at his job. Maybe he'd done it before, like he'd said. Maybe Sarah wasn't the first lonely woman he'd targeted. Maybe I wasn't the first father who'd noticed too late. But I'd be the last. 2 weeks later, Richard Cole called. "Mr. Harris, we need to meet. In person. Immediately." The urgency in his voice made my blood run cold. That afternoon, sitting in his office, Cole laid out a folder in front of me. "Your daughter's fiancé doesn't exist. Not as Chris Parker, anyway." I stared at the documents. Background checks. Police reports. News articles. "His real name is Christopher Daniel Richmond," Cole continued. "And Mr. Harris, Sarah isn't his first victim." The world tilted. I gripped the desk to steady myself. "2 previous marriages," Cole said quietly. "Both women disappeared under suspicious circumstances after transferring their assets to him. The FBI has been investigating, but they don't have enough evidence for an arrest." I looked at the photos. Jessica Lynch, vanished 2021 in Oregon. Amanda West, vanished 2023 in Nevada. Both beautiful, both alone, both with significant assets. Both dead, almost certainly. "The wedding," I managed to say. "It's in 3 weeks." Cole nodded. "I've already contacted the FBI agent handling the case, Agent Jennifer Scott. She wants to meet with you." I stood up, my mind racing. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to save my daughter from a serial killer. "Set up the meeting," I said. "And Cole, this doesn't end at the wedding. This ends with Chris Parker in prison." Cole's expression was grim. "The FBI says they need evidence, hard evidence. Without it, he walks." I thought about Sarah, about how she'd looked at me with such anger and confusion, about Chris's confident smile, about 2 women who'd loved the wrong man and paid with their lives. "Then we'll get them their evidence," I said, "whatever it takes." As I left Cole's office, I felt something shift inside me. The scared, uncertain father was gone. In his place was someone colder, more focused, a hunter. The FBI field office in Sacramento was 120 miles from Lake Tahoe. I made the drive the next morning, my hands steady on the wheel, despite the storm raging in my head. Jessica Lynch, Amanda West, 2 women who'd trusted the wrong man, 2 families who'd never gotten closure. Sarah would not be number 3. Agent Jennifer Scott met me in a windowless conference room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. She was in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, eyes that had seen too much. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm, professional. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming." She spread files across the table between us. Crime scene photos, financial records, witness statements, the documentation of Christopher Daniel Richmond's life as a predator. "Jessica Lynch," Scott began, tapping a photo of a smiling blonde woman. 32 years old, Portland realtor. Met Chris at a charity auction in 2020. Married him 8 months later. 3 months after the wedding, she transferred her house, valued at $890,000, into joint ownership. 2 weeks later, she disappeared during a hiking trip in the Columbia River Gorge. I stared at Jessica's photo. She had Sarah's smile. That same open, trusting expression. "And Amanda West?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Scott pulled out another file. 28, Las Vegas. Real estate investor. Same pattern. Met Chris in 2022. married in 2023, transferred a rental property portfolio worth $1.2 million, vanished during a camping trip near Lake Mead. Her car was found at a trailhead. She wasn't. How does he do it? My voice was barely above a whisper. We don't know. No bodies means no crime scenes, no forensic evidence. He's careful, methodical. He chooses isolated locations, hikes or camping trips where accidents are plausible. By the time anyone reports them missing, any evidence is gone. I looked at the photos of both women. Different faces, same story. Different dreams, same nightmare. You know he's guilty, I said. Why haven't you arrested him? Scott's jaw tightened. Knowing and proving are different things. We have circumstantial evidence. The pattern, the financial transfers, his presence at both disappearances. But his lawyers are good. They argue coincidence. Bad luck. He's the grieving widower, devastated by loss. Juries eat it up. So he just walks free? Moves on to the next victim? Until now, yes. Scott leaned forward. But you, Mr. Harris, you're giving us something we've never had before. A victim who's still alive? A family member who's aware before the wedding? A chance to catch him in the act. The weight of her words settled over me. I wasn't just protecting Sarah. I was the key to stopping the serial killer. What do you need from me? Everything, Scott said. Your cooperation, your house, your patience. We need to document his intentions, record his conversations, build a case so airtight that no lawyer can punch through it. You want me to let him keep planning to kill my daughter? I want you to help us make sure he never gets the chance. Her voice softened slightly. I know what I'm asking, Mr. Harris. It's not easy. But if we move too soon, if we spook him, he'll disappear, and we'll never get another shot at him. I thought about Sarah, about the way Chris had isolated her, turned her against me. If I went to her now with wild accusations about her fiancé being a murderer, she'd never believe me. She'd warn him. He'd vanish. And someday, maybe a year from now, maybe 5, I'd get a call that Sarah had disappeared on a hiking trip. Tell me what to do, I said. Over the next 2 hours, Scott laid out the plan. They'd get a warrant for surveillance in my home, audio and video, hidden in common areas where Chris spent time. They'd monitor his communications, track his movements, document every lie, every manipulation. The wedding would proceed as planned, right up until the moment we had enough evidence to arrest him. And Sarah? I asked. When do we tell her? Not until we have to. The less she knows, the less likely she'll inadvertently tip him off. She's under his influence right now, Mr. Harris. He's been conditioning her for months. If we tell her he's a monster, her first instinct might be to defend him. I hated it. Every cell in my body wanted to grab Sarah, shake her awake, make her see the truth. But Scott was right. I'd already tried talking to her, and she'd accused me of being controlling. Chris had done his job well. When does the surveillance start? I asked. Tomorrow. We'll send a team to install equipment while Chris is at work. You'll need to be there to let them in. Can you do that? I nodded. Whatever it takes. As I drove back to Lake Tahoe that evening, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. At a gas station, I watched a man fill up a Mercedes, while his wife waited in the passenger seat. She looked tired, worn down, the way Sarah had looked lately. At a coffee shop, I saw a young couple arguing in the parking lot. The man was gesturing aggressively while the woman's shoulders hunched inward, making herself smaller, defensive. The world was full of predators. I'd just been blind to the one sleeping in my guest room. Back home, I walked through my house with new eyes. The living room where Chris had interrogated me about property values. The kitchen where he'd made himself comfortable, acting like he already owned everything. The guest room where he'd made his phone call, carelessly confident that no one was listening. I stood in the doorway of that room, looking at the neatly made bed, the small pile of Chris's belongings on the dresser, a watch, a wallet, keys to Sarah's apartment. He'd integrated himself so thoroughly into our lives that his presence felt normal. That was his greatest weapon, normalcy. The next morning, the FBI tech team arrived at 8 a.m., posing as cable installers. I watched them work, placing tiny cameras in smoke detectors, microphones in air vents, recording equipment in my basement. They were surgical, efficient. Within 3 hours, my home was a surveillance nest. Remember, the team leader said as they packed up, act natural. Don't look at the cameras. Don't adjust your behavior. If he notices something's off, this whole operation falls apart. After they left, I sat in my living room, acutely aware of the camera hidden in the ceiling fixture. It felt like being watched, because I was. That evening, Chris came over for dinner with Sarah. I watched him differently now, cataloging every gesture, every word, the way he touched Sarah's lower back, possessive, the way he steered conversations, controlling the narrative, the way he asked, casually, whether I'd updated my will recently. Just thinking about family planning, he said with that perfect smile. Sarah and I want to make sure everything's in order before the wedding. You know, in case anything happens. In case anything happens. As if my death were an inevitability, he was already planning around. My will's current, I said carefully. Everything goes to Sarah. Of course, Chris nodded approvingly. But have you considered a living trust? More efficient for estate transfers. I know a great attorney who specializes in this stuff. Happy to make an introduction. I bet you do, I thought. An attorney you control who'd help you reshape my estate planning to your advantage. I'll think about it, I said. Sarah smiled at me then, and for a moment she looked like herself again. Happy, hopeful, completely unaware that she was sitting next to a man who'd killed at least twice before. After they left, I sat in the dark, imagining the FBI agents in some monitoring station, listening to everything, recording everything, building their case brick by brick. Somewhere in that house, cameras were watching, microphones were listening, and Chris Parker, confident predator, had no idea he was already caught in a trap. He'd said he'd done this before, that it was foolproof, but he'd never done it with me. The surveillance yielded results faster than I'd expected. Agent Scott called 3 days after the equipment was installed, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. We got him on tape. Last night, while you were asleep, he made a call from your guest room. I gripped the phone. What did he say? Come to Sacramento. You need to hear this yourself. 2 hours later, I was back in that windowless conference room, headphones on, listening to my daughter's fiancé casually discuss how he planned to murder her. Chris's voice came through crystal clear. The wedding's in 3 weeks. After the honeymoon, I'll get her to sign the property transfer documents. The old man already trusts me. He'll witness whatever I put in front of him. Once the house is in our names jointly, I'll initiate phase 2. Same as before? Another man's voice. I didn't recognize it. Same as before. Hiking trip. Fallen Leaf Lake has some great trails. Remote, steep terrain, easy to stage an accident. I've already been scouting locations. There's a cliff overlook about 4 miles in. Perfect drop. I'll take her there for a romantic sunrise hike. One slip, and gravity does the rest. My hands were shaking. I pulled off the headphones. There's more, Scott said gently. She fast-forwarded the recording. Listen to this part. Chris again. The beauty of it is, everyone will blame the father. He never approved of me, made it obvious he didn't want us together. When Sarah dies, I'll be the devastated husband, and he'll be the overprotective dad who drove his daughter away. No one will question it. And once I sell that $2.8 million house and liquidate his accounts, I'm set for years. I felt something cold and sharp settle into my chest. This wasn't just about money or property. This was personal. He'd planned to frame me, emotionally, if not legally, for Sarah's death, the grieving father whose disapproval had supposedly caused the rift that led to her tragic accident. Mr. Harris, Scott's voice seemed distant. Are you all right? I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We have enough now, she continued. The recordings, combined with the pattern from Jessica and Amanda, give us grounds for arrest. We can pick him up today. No, I heard myself say. Scott frowned. Mr. Harris, if you arrest him now, Sarah will never believe it. She'll think I fabricated evidence to break them up. You said it yourself. His lawyers are good. They'll argue entrapment, illegal surveillance, fruit of the poisonous tree. They'll get the recordings thrown out. We have a warrant, and they'll challenge it. Say I manipulated the FBI because I didn't approve of my daughter's relationship. Paint me as the villain and Chris as the victim. I leaned forward. No, we need something he can't deny. Something public. something that forces Sarah to see the truth with her own eyes. Scott studied me carefully. What are you proposing? We let the wedding happen. Everything proceeds as planned. We invite everyone, friends, family, community. And at the ceremony, with 100 witnesses present, we expose him. FBI on site, ready to arrest. Press notified. Everything above board, everything public. He won't be able to manipulate the narrative. Sarah will see exactly who she was about to marry. That's risky, Scott said. If something goes wrong, if he gets spooked. He won't, because he thinks he's winning. I thought about Chris's confidence, his casual arrogance. Predators like him, they think they're smarter than everyone else. He doesn't see me as a threat. He sees me as a fool. Scott considered this. We'd need to coordinate with local law enforcement. Position agents at the church. Have everything ready to move the second you give the signal. Can you do it? I can do it. The question is, can you? You'll have to watch your daughter walk down the aisle to a serial killer. You'll have to sit through the ceremony, keeping your composure, knowing what's coming. That's not easy, Mr. Harris. Nothing about this is easy, I said, but it's the only way to make sure Sarah is safe and that he never does this again. We spent the next hour working out the details. The FBI would maintain surveillance, documenting everything Chris said and did. I'd play along, the trusting, slightly foolish father, keeping him comfortable. Sarah would remain unaware, for her own protection and to maintain the facade. One more thing, Scott said as I was leaving. We found the man Chris was talking to on the phone, David Brenner, a real estate lawyer in Nevada. He helped Chris liquidate Amanda West's properties after she disappeared. We're bringing him in for questioning. Is he an accomplice? Probably. At minimum, he knew something was wrong and looked the other way. We'll flip him, get him to testify against Chris. It's all coming together, Mr. Harris. As I drove home that evening, I felt the weight of what I'd committed to. 3 more weeks of pretending. 3 more weeks of watching Chris manipulate Sarah, knowing what he planned to do to her. 3 more weeks of biting my tongue while a killer made himself comfortable in my home. But 3 weeks was nothing compared to a lifetime of Sarah's safety. Back at the house, I found myself going through the motions of normal life. I watered the plants Catherine had loved. I organized my collection of vintage watches, running my fingers over the intricate mechanisms. I stood on the deck and watched the sun set over Lake Tahoe, turning the water gold and crimson. This was my home, my sanctuary. Chris Parker thought he could take it. Thought he could take my daughter, my legacy, my life's work. He thought wrong. That night, Sarah stopped by, alone. Chris had a business meeting in Sacramento, probably meeting with his lawyer accomplice. She seemed fragile, uncertain. "Dad," she said quietly, "I'm sorry about what I said last week, about you being clingy. That wasn't fair." I pulled her into a hug. "You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart. Everything's happening so fast. The wedding, moving, planning our future. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning." Every instinct screamed at me to tell her the truth, to show her the FBI files, play her the recordings, make her see, but I couldn't. Not yet. "That's normal," I said instead. "Big life changes are scary. But you know I'm always here, right? Whatever you need, whenever you need it." She hugged me tighter. "I know, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, Sarah. More than you'll ever know." After she left, I stood in the middle of my living room, aware of the cameras watching, the microphones listening. Somewhere, FBI agents were monitoring, recording, building the case that would put Chris Parker away forever. He'd called me a fool, an easy mark, a lonely old man desperate to keep his daughter close. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The wedding was 3 weeks away. In 3 weeks, Christopher Daniel Richmond would be in handcuffs, his carefully constructed facade shattered in front of everyone he'd tried to deceive. In 3 weeks, Sarah would be safe. In 3 weeks, Jessica Lynch and Amanda West would have justice. I just had to hold on that long. I poured myself a scotch and raised the glass toward the hidden camera in my ceiling. "To patience," I said quietly, "and to justice." The countdown had begun. The wedding day arrived like an executioner's appointment, inevitable, precisely scheduled, carrying the weight of finality. I woke before dawn, unable to sleep. Through my bedroom window, Lake Tahoe reflected the emerging sunlight, turning the water into liquid gold. It was going to be a beautiful day. Perfect weather for a wedding. Perfect weather for justice. By 8 in the morning, St. Mary's Church on Al Tahoe Boulevard was already buzzing with activity. The florist arrived first, carrying armfuls of white roses and lilies. Then the caterers. Then the photographer, a young woman with 3 cameras around her neck, who kept asking if I wanted candid father of the bride shots. I smiled and posed where she asked. The doting father, the proud patriarch, playing my role perfectly. Agent Scott had called the night before with final instructions. She and 3 other agents would be positioned in the church, dressed as wedding guests. Local police were stationed outside in unmarked vehicles. The moment I gave the signal, standing up during the ceremony, they'd move in. "How are you holding up?" Scott had asked. "I'm ready," I'd said, and I was. Sarah had spent the night at a hotel with her bridesmaids, following tradition. I hadn't seen her since the rehearsal dinner 2 days ago, where she'd been pale and quiet, picking out her food while Chris held court, charming everyone with stories about their honeymoon plans. "We're thinking of hiking at Fallen Leaf Lake," Chris had said, and I'd felt my blood turn to ice. That was where he planned to kill her. He was telling everyone in advance, setting up the narrative, the tragic accident on the romantic post-wedding hike. But that narrative would never be written. At the church, I stood in the vestibule, adjusting my tie for the 4th time. The guests were arriving, Sarah's college friends, my former colleagues, neighbors from around the lake. 120 people, all dressed in their finest, all expecting a celebration. They were about to get something very different. Chris arrived at 10, flanked by his best man, some friend from Sacramento I'd never met before today. Chris looked confident, relaxed, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than he'd legitimately earned in months. He saw me and smiled, that same calculating smile I'd learned to read. "Big day, Winfred," he said, extending his hand. I shook it, feeling the cool pressure of a killer's palm against mine. "Indeed it is. Thanks for everything. The support, opening your home to us, being so welcoming. It means a lot." His voice dripped with false sincerity. I wanted to tell him I knew exactly what he was, that I'd listened to his plans, read his files, documented his crimes, that in less than an hour he'd be in handcuffs. But I just smiled and said, "Family takes care of family." His eyes flickered with something, satisfaction maybe. He thought he'd won, thought he'd fooled the old man completely. Agent Scott arrived at 10:15 wearing an elegant navy dress and pearls. She could have been anyone's aunt or family friend. No one gave her a second glance as she slipped into a pew near the back. I caught her eye briefly. She nodded almost imperceptibly. The other agents filtered in over the next 20 minutes, a couple in their 40s, a single man with gray hair, all positioned strategically near exits. At 10:45, the wedding coordinator, a nervous woman named Patricia, rushed up to me. "Mr. Harris, Sarah's ready." "Are you?" Was I ready to watch my daughter walk down the aisle toward a serial killer? Ready to sit through a ceremony I knew would never be completed? Ready to shatter her world in front of everyone she knew? "I'm ready," I said. I walked to the small room where Sarah was waiting with her bridesmaids. When I saw her, my breath caught. She was beautiful in her white dress, her hair swept up, a bouquet of white roses clutched in her trembling hands. But her eyes were wrong, red-rimmed, frightened. "Dad," she whispered, and her voice cracked. I crossed to her, took her hands. They were ice cold. "Sarah, sweetheart, are you okay?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her bridesmaids, who were chattering excitedly about the ceremony, then back at me. "Dad, 5 minutes," Patricia called from the doorway. Sarah's fingers tightened on mine. There was something desperate in her grip, something that made my chest ache. She wanted to tell me something, needed to tell me something. "It's okay," I said quietly. "Whatever it is, it's okay. I'm here." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Her bridesmaids fussed over her, fixing a strand of hair, adjusting her veil. The moment passed. The organ music started, Wagner's bridal chorus, that traditional march that had accompanied countless brides down countless aisles. Sarah slipped her arm through mine. "I love you, Dad," she said. I love you too, baby. So much. We stepped into the aisle. Every head turned to look at us. Flashbulbs popped. Someone gasped, probably at how beautiful Sarah looked. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on Chris standing at the altar next to Reverend Miller, the officiant Sarah had chosen. Chris's face, as he watched Sarah approach, was perfect. The loving groom, overcome with emotion. If I didn't know what he really was, I might have believed it. We reached the altar. Reverend Miller smiled warmly. Who gives this woman to be married to this man? This was the moment I was supposed to say, I do, and hand Sarah over. Instead, I looked at my daughter, at her frightened eyes, at the way she was trembling. I stepped back, released her arm, and took my seat in the front pew. Exactly as planned. The ceremony began. Reverend Miller spoke about love, commitment, the sacred bond of marriage. His words felt hollow, echoing in the vaulted ceiling of the church. I watched Sarah's back, saw her shoulders tense, saw Chris take her hands, his grip possessive. Agent Scott sat 3 rows behind me. I could feel her presence, ready to move. Reverend Miller reached the traditional part of the ceremony. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence. I remained seated, though every fiber of my being wanted to stand, to shout, to stop this charade. But I had to wait, had to follow the plan. Reverend Miller continued, Christopher Daniel Parker, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Chris's voice was smooth, confident. Then Miller turned to Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Harris, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Sarah hesitated. The pause stretched. I saw Chris's hand tighten on hers. She turned her head slightly, finding me in the front row. Our eyes met, and then she did something that wasn't part of any plan. Under the pretense of adjusting her bouquet, she pulled something from between the roses, a small piece of paper, folded tight. She turned toward me as if to show me her flowers, and in that movement pressed the note into my hand. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. The handwriting was tiny, frantic, barely legible. Dad, he's a monster. Save me. Threatened to kill me if I don't marry him. Says he knows how to make people disappear. Please. The world narrowed to that piece of paper, to Sarah's terrified eyes. To the monster standing beside her, wearing a wedding suit and a practiced smile. I stood up. The entire church fell silent. 120 people turned to look at me. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Chris's expression flickered, confusion, then irritation. Reverend Miller stopped mid-sentence. Mr. Harris, is something wrong? I stepped into the aisle, the note clutched in my hand. My voice, when I spoke, was steady as stone. This ceremony is over. The words echoed through St. Mary's Church like a thunderclap. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Chris exploded. What the hell? Sit down! But I didn't sit down. I didn't move. I just stood there, looking at Sarah, letting her see the certainty in my eyes. This wedding, I said clearly, will not be happening. Not today. Not ever. Sarah made a sound, half sob, half gasp of relief, and her knees buckled. I moved forward, catching her before she fell, and she collapsed against me, the bouquet tumbling from her hands. Sarah, you're safe, I said into her hair. I know everything. You're safe now. She started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Chris's face transformed. The charming smile vanished, replaced by something cold and reptilian. You senile old fool. You're ruining your daughter's wedding. Are you insane? No, I said calmly, holding Sarah as she clung to me. I'm finally seeing clearly. The church erupted. Guests were standing, confused voices rising. Sarah's bridesmaids rushed forward. Chris's best man grabbed his shoulder, asking what was happening. Chris shook him off. His eyes locked on mine, and I saw the calculation happening behind them. He was deciding whether to bluff through this or run. I made the decision for him. Agent Scott, I said clearly, I believe you wanted to speak with Mr. Parker. The woman in the navy dress stood up in the back row. She reached into her purse and pulled out a badge, holding it high. Federal Bureau of Investigation, she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. 3 other guests stood simultaneously, producing badges. They moved toward the altar with practiced efficiency, cutting off the exits. Chris's face went from red to white in seconds. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. What? What is this? Christopher Daniel Richmond, Agent Scott said, reaching the altar. 2 male agents flanked her. Also known as Chris Parker. You're under arrest for suspicion of fraud, forgery, and involvement in the disappearances of Jessica Lynch and Amanda West. This is insane, Chris's voice cracked. He looked around wildly, searching for an escape route. This is a setup. He did this. He pointed at me, his hand shaking. The old man's crazy. He couldn't stand that I was marrying his daughter. You have the right to remain silent, Scott continued, unmoved. One of the agents pulled out handcuffs. That's when Chris ran. He shoved past Reverend Miller, knocking the elderly man into his podium, and sprinted toward the side exit. But Agent Scott had planned for this. 2 more agents appeared in that doorway, blocking his path. Chris spun back, desperate now, his expensive suit jacket flying open. He headed for the main entrance, but the male agent from the back pew was already there, trapped. Chris stood in the center of the church, surrounded, his perfect facade crumbling. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands clenched and unclenched. His eyes darted from exit to exit, finding them all blocked. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Scott said. You can't do this, Chris said, but his voice had lost its confidence. You don't have any evidence. This is harassment. We have 3 weeks of recorded conversations, I said quietly, including the one where you described exactly how you planned to kill my daughter at Fallen Leaf Lake, the same place Amanda West disappeared. Chris's eyes snapped to me. For the first time, I saw real fear there. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. We have David Brenner in custody, Scott added. Your lawyer friend. He's been very cooperative. Told us all about the property transfers, the schemes, the money. Chris's legs seemed to give out. He stumbled backward, catching himself on a pew. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving him gray as old paper. You can't, he started, but his voice broke. I didn't, Sarah. Tell them I love you. Tell them. You threatened to kill me, Sarah said from my arms. Her voice was steady now, strengthened by my presence. You said if I didn't marry you, I'd disappear just like the others. You said you knew how to do it, that nobody would ever find me. Chris stared at her, and something ugly crossed his face. Not remorse, not shame. Rage, pure, impotent rage. "You stupid little—" he started. "That's enough." Agent Scott nodded to her team. 2 agents moved forward. Chris tried one last desperate move. He lunged toward Sarah, hands outstretched. Whether to grab her or harm her, I'll never know. He didn't make it 3 steps. The agents tackled him, slamming him face first into the marble floor. The sound echoed through the church like a gunshot. Someone in the audience screamed. In seconds, Chris was in handcuffs, being hauled to his feet. His nose was bleeding. His suit was torn. His perfect hair was mussed. He looked small suddenly, diminished, a cheap con man in expensive clothes. Christopher Daniel Richmond, Agent Scott said formally, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and suspicion of involvement in the murders of Jessica Lynch and Amanda West. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. I didn't kill anyone, Chris shrieked. This is insane. You're all insane. But the agents were already dragging him toward the exit. He struggled, his polished shoes scraping against the floor, his voice rising to a desperate pitch. Winfred! Mr. Harris! Please! This is a misunderstanding. We can talk about this. The house. You can have it all. Just tell them. Please. I said nothing, just held Sarah and watched him being pulled away. At the doorway, Chris made one last attempt to turn back. His eyes found mine across the church. Gone was every trace of the charming young man who'd asked about property values and smiled over family dinners. What remained was something raw and hateful. You took everything from me, he snarled. $2.8 million? My future? You destroyed me, you miserable old. I took nothing from you, I said quietly. I simply kept what was mine, including my daughter. The agents forced him through the doorway. His voice faded as they pulled him outside, still protesting, still threatening, still refusing to accept that his perfect plan had collapsed. The church doors closed. Silence fell. 120 guests sat frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Whispers started, then grew louder. Someone was crying. Someone else was on their phone, probably calling the local news. I didn't care about any of them. I only cared about Sarah, who was sobbing against my shoulder, her wedding dress rumpled, her veil askew, her makeup running down her face. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't know. I didn't see it. I'm so stupid." "Shh," I said, stroking her hair. "You're not stupid. You're human, and he's very good at what he does. He said if I tried to leave, if I told anyone, he'd kill me. He showed me articles about women who disappeared. Said it was easy, that nobody ever found them. I know, sweetheart, I know. When did you? I'll tell you everything, I promised. But right now, let's just get you out of here." Agent Scott approached us. "Mr. Harris, we'll need statements from both of you. But that can wait a few hours. Take your daughter home." I nodded, grateful. I guided Sarah toward the side exit, away from the main doors where guests were congregating. Her bridesmaids followed, shocked and silent. Outside, police cars lined the street, lights flashing. I could see Chris in the back of one, his hands cuffed behind him, his head down. As we emerged, he looked up. Our eyes met one final time. I saw defeat there, and hatred, and the terrible realization that he'd been caught. I turned away, guiding Sarah toward my car. "Dad," she said as I opened the passenger door for her, "you saved my life." "Always," I said. "That's what fathers do." As we drove away from St. Mary's Church, leaving behind the chaos and the cameras and the canceled wedding, I felt something loosen in my chest. The 3 weeks of pretending were over. The plan had worked. Chris Parker, Christopher Daniel Richmond, would never hurt anyone again. In the rearview mirror, I watched the church recede into the distance. Sarah was safe. That was all that mattered. The rest was just paperwork. I was wrong about the paperwork. The days following the church arrest became a whirlwind of activity that made my 3 weeks of surveillance look peaceful by comparison. The FBI descended on my house like an organized army, seizing every piece of evidence we'd collected. Chris's laptop from the guest room, the hidden cameras and microphones, every recording, every transcript, every digital footprint he'd left behind. Agent Scott called me the morning after the arrest. "Mr. Harris, we need you to come to Sacramento. There's something you need to see." 2 hours later, I sat in the same conference room where this had all begun, staring at a laptop screen. Sarah was beside me, pale but determined. A FBI computer forensics specialist named Marcus Chen stood behind us, explaining what they'd found. Chris, or Christopher Richmond, his real name, kept encrypted files on his laptop, Chen said. "We cracked the encryption this morning. What we found is comprehensive." He clicked a key. A document appeared on screen. The title made my blood run cold. Lake Tahoe Project. Timeline and Execution Strategy. It was a detailed plan. Every step Chris had taken with Sarah was documented. The initial meeting, not coincidental, but planned, after he'd researched her online and discovered she was my daughter. The courtship strategy, including specific manipulation techniques to isolate her from me. The wedding timeline, and then the post-wedding plan. Week 1 to 2 after wedding. Establish joint ownership of property at 1176 Lakeshore Boulevard. Utilize emotional leverage and WH's trust. WH, that was me. Winfred Harris. He'd reduced me to initials in his murder plan. Week 3. Initiate hiking trip suggestion. Target location. Fallen Leaf Lake Trail. Same site as AW operation. AW Amanda West. My hands clenched into fists. Sarah read ahead, her breathing growing rapid. Week 4. Execute accident scenario. Details match successful protocols from previous operations. She couldn't finish. She covered her mouth, turning away from the screen. I kept reading. The accident scenario was laid out with chilling precision. The time of day, early morning when the trail would be empty. The exact cliff overlook, 100-foot drop. How he'd position her near the edge while taking a photo. The push would look like she'd lost her balance. The timeline for reporting her missing. The grieving husband act he'd perform for authorities. There's more. Chen said quietly. He opened another file. This one was titled Asset Liquidation Schedule. It showed how Chris planned to sell my house within 6 months of Sarah's death. The estimated sale price, $2.9 million. His projected net profit after legal fees and taxes, $2.1 million. He'd even calculated how much he'd spend on her funeral. Budget, $8,000. My daughter's life reduced to a line item in a business plan. The files referenced 2 previous operations, Agent Scott said, entering the room. She laid out printed documents. We cross-referenced with the Jessica Lynch and Amanda West cases. The methods are identical. Same trail selection criteria. Same accident staging. Same asset liquidation timeline. But this time, I said, my voice rough, you have proof. This time, Scott agreed, we have everything. His planning documents, the surveillance recordings, the property fraud attempt with Sarah, and now these files that directly reference the previous murders. Sarah finally spoke, her voice small. He wrote about killing me like it was a project, like he was planning a vacation. I pulled her close. But he didn't get to. That plan died the moment you handed me that note. There's something else, Chen said. He pulled up an email folder. Chris corresponded with someone named David Brenner, the real estate lawyer in Nevada. They discussed all 3 operations. Brenner helped liquidate the properties after Jessica and Amanda disappeared. He knew what Chris was doing. We arrested Brenner yesterday, Scott said. He's cooperating. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he's providing testimony about the entire operation. Dates, financial transfers, conversations. He kept records of everything. Why would he keep records? Sarah asked. Scott's smile was grim. Insurance. Criminals like Brenner always keep insurance against their partners. He knew if Chris ever turned on him, he'd need leverage. Over the following days, the case against Chris, Christopher Daniel Richmond, became airtight. The FBI forensics team found more evidence. Chris's phone contained photos of Fallen Leaf Lake Trail, including the specific cliff where he'd planned to kill Sarah. The photos were dated from a week before the wedding. He'd been scouting the location, preparing like a hunter studying his killing ground. Search warrants for his storage unit in Sacramento revealed even more damning evidence. A laptop containing research on accidental death investigation procedures and how long before missing persons are declared dead. Financial documents showing his profit from Jessica Lynch's estate, $711,000 after liquidation. From Amanda West, $987,000. The district attorney called me personally. Mr. Harris, we're charging Richmond with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Even without Amanda West's body, the pattern and his own documentation make the case solid. We're also adding attempted murder for Sarah. Fraud. Conspiracy. He's looking at life without parole. Minimum. Minimum? I asked. We're in California. If we can prove special circumstances, multiple murders, financial gain, we can pursue more severe penalties. But the most important breakthrough came 3 weeks after the arrest. The FBI got a tip from a hiker in Oregon's Willamette National Forest. Following the GPS coordinates from Chris's encrypted files, they found a shallow grave in a remote area off the Columbia River Gorge Trail system. Jessica Lynch. After 4 years, her family finally had answers. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Chris's DNA under her fingernails. She'd fought back. Injuries consistent with being pushed off a cliff, then moved post-mortem to the burial site. The medical examiner's report was unequivocal. Homicide. I attended the press conference where Agent Scott announced the findings. Jessica's mother, Dorothy Fillingham, a woman in her late 60s with gray hair and tired eyes, stood beside Scott. When the agent finished speaking, Mrs. Fillingham approached me. Mr. Harris, she said, her voice thick with emotion, Agent Scott told me what you did, how you saved your daughter. I'm so sorry about Jessica, I said. I wish... Don't, she gripped my hands. Don't apologize. You did what any parent would do. You protected your child. Her voice broke. I just wish someone had protected mine. We stood there in the hallway outside the press conference, 2 parents connected by Chris's evil, and I felt the full weight of what had almost happened. Sarah could have been Jessica, could have been Amanda, could have been buried in some remote forest, her location saved as GPS coordinates in a killer's encrypted files. That evening, I sat with Sarah on our deck overlooking Lake Tahoe. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. She'd been living with me since the arrest, too shaken to return to her apartment where Chris's belongings still remained. "I keep thinking about the note," she said quietly. "If I hadn't written it, if I'd been too scared, if you hadn't understood, but you did write it, and I did understand. That's what matters." "He had it all planned," she whispered. "Every detail. The hiking trip, the cliff. My funeral budget was $8,000, Dad. 8,000. I pulled her close. "He underestimated two things, your courage and a father's intuition." She was quiet for a moment. "Agent Scott said Chris is fighting the charges. His lawyer is claiming the encrypted files were planted." "Of course he is. Men like Chris never accept responsibility." "Will you have to testify?" "Yes, and so will you." She nodded, her jaw setting with determination. "Good. I want to face him. I want him to see that I survived, that we both survived." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I'd face Christopher Daniel Richmond again, this time across a courtroom. And this time, he'd learned that the old fool he'd tried to con had brought down his entire operation. The preliminary hearing took place in late July in a courthouse in Sacramento. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that gave everything a harsh institutional quality. I sat in the gallery with Sarah, watching as they brought Chris in. He wore an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking nothing like the polished man who'd charmed his way into our lives. His hair was unkempt. His face was pale from weeks in county jail. But his eyes, those were the same. Cold, calculating, hateful. When he saw me, his expression twisted. He leaned toward his lawyer, a slick defense attorney named Marcus Weinberg, who'd flown in from Los Angeles. Whatever Chris whispered made Weinberg's eyebrows raise. The hearing began. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Mendez, laid out the evidence, the encrypted files, the surveillance recordings, David Brenner's testimony, the discovery of Jessica Lynch's body, the DNA evidence, the financial records showing Chris's profit from his previous victims. It was devastating, comprehensive, irrefutable, but Weinberg was good at his job. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client maintains his innocence. The so-called encrypted files were allegedly found on a laptop seized from Mr. Harris's home. A laptop my client claims was planted with fabricated evidence by Mr. Harris himself, a man with clear motive to destroy my client's relationship with his daughter." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me. "The surveillance was conducted without my client's knowledge or consent," Weinberg continued. "Mr. Harris admits to working with the FBI to, in his own words, trap my client. This is entrapment, Your Honor. This is a vindictive father who couldn't accept his daughter's choice of partner and used his connections to manufacture a criminal case." Mendez stood immediately. "Your Honor, the surveillance was conducted under a valid warrant, approved by a federal judge after probable cause was established." Mr. Richmond's own words, recorded on his own phone, describe his intention to defraud and harm the victim. The encrypted files contain details that only the perpetrator would know, including GPS coordinates that led directly to Jessica Lynch's remains. "Coordinates that, Mr. Harris could have obtained through other means," Weinberg shot back. "My client has been vilified in the media as the Lake Tahoe scammer. But where's the actual evidence of murder? A laptop anyone could have accessed? Hearsay from a convicted criminal trying to reduce his own sentence?" The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, named Patricia Horton, held up her hand. "Mr. Weinberg, are you seriously arguing that Mr. Harris orchestrated the murder of Jessica Lynch 4 years ago, hid her body in the Willamette National Forest, and then framed your client for it?" "I'm arguing that the evidence is circumstantial and tainted by personal bias, Your Honor." "The DNA evidence isn't circumstantial," Mendez countered. "Christopher Richmond's DNA was found under Jessica Lynch's fingernails. His DNA was found at the burial site. Unless Mr. Harris is a time traveler, there's no way he planted that evidence 4 years ago." Chris suddenly stood up, shaking off his lawyer's restraining hand. "This is insane. That old man is lying. He manipulated everything because he's jealous, because he couldn't stand that Sarah chose me over him. Mr. Richmond, sit down, Judge Horton commanded. No, I won't sit quietly while he destroys my life. Chris's voice rose, desperate and angry. I loved Sarah. I was going to marry her, and he ruined it because of his own sick need to control her. Mr. Richmond, he took everything from me, Chris was shouting now, his face red, spit flying. My future, my reputation, $2.8 million. That house should have been mine. The courtroom fell silent. Even Weinberg looked stunned. Chris's own lawyer was staring at him in horror. Should have been yours? Judge Horton repeated slowly. On what basis? Chris seemed to realize what he'd said. His mouth worked silently. I just meant, after Sarah and I were married, we would have... You never married Sarah, Mendez said quietly. The wedding was stopped. Yet you believe a house owned by her father should have been yours. I misspoke, Chris said, but the damage was done. Judge Horton made a note. Mr. Richmond, I advise you to follow your attorney's counsel and remain quiet. Mr. Weinberg, control your client, or I'll have him removed. They forced Chris back into his seat. He glared at me across the courtroom, and I stared back, unflinching. He'd just confirmed, in his own words, exactly what his encrypted files had documented. The house was his motive. Sarah was just the means to get it. The hearing continued for another hour. Weinberg tried to recover, but Chris's outburst had undermined their entire defense. When Judge Horton finally spoke, her voice was cold. Based on the evidence presented, I find probable cause exists for all charges. 3 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy. The defendant will be held without bail pending trial. Given the severity of the charges and the defendant's clear flight risk, I'm remanding him to the custody of the U.S. Marshals for transfer to a federal detention facility. Chris erupted again. This is a setup. You're all corrupt. Harris paid you off, didn't he? You're all working together. Remove the defendant, Judge Horton ordered. 2 bailiffs grabbed Chris, hauling him toward the door. He fought them, still screaming. Winfred, you'll pay for this. I'll get out. And when I do... The door closed behind him, cutting off his threats. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Judge Horton looked directly at me. Mr. Harris, on behalf of the court, thank you for your cooperation with law enforcement. Your actions likely saved your daughter's life and helped to bring justice for other victims. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in my face. Mr. Harris, how do you feel about the judge's decision? Sarah, what message do you have for other women? Will you be testifying at trial? Agent Scott appeared, helping us navigate through the crowd to her car. Once we were inside, safely away from the chaos, Sarah started crying. Not sad tears. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. It's real, she said. He's really going to prison. He can't hurt anyone anymore. The trial hasn't happened yet, I cautioned. But it will, Scott said from the driver's seat. His outburst today destroyed any credibility his defense might have had. Weinberg will probably try to negotiate a plea deal, but given the evidence, we won't offer anything less than life without parole. What about Amanda West? I asked. You never found her body. We have Chris's files documenting her murder. We have the property transfers. We have Brenner's testimony about disposing of her belongings. The case is solid, even without remains. Scott glanced at us in the rearview mirror. Your testimony will be crucial, though. Both of you. You'll need to be prepared for that. Sarah wiped her eyes. When? Probably September. The trial will be big. Media coverage, public interest. It won't be easy. I took Sarah's hand. We'll be ready. As we drove back toward Lake Tahoe, I watched the landscape roll past. The mountains, the forests, the clear blue sky. Everything looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but nothing was the same. We'd been touched by evil and survived it. Chris had called me an old fool, a vengeful father, a liar, but I'd done something he never expected. I'd listened. I'd trusted my instincts. I'd protected my daughter. And in doing so, I'd stopped a serial killer. The trial was coming. There would be more testimony, more pain, more public scrutiny, but we'd face it together. And when it was over, Christopher Daniel Richmond would spend the rest of his life in a cell, while Sarah and I would return to our lakeside home and rebuild what he'd tried to destroy. That wasn't revenge. That was justice. The trial began in early September at the federal courthouse in Sacramento. The media had dubbed it the Lake Tahoe Killer Trial, and the public interest was massive. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse. Reporters competed for sound bites. Court TV was broadcasting live. I turned down most interview requests, but I agreed to one with a victim advocacy group that wanted to highlight how families could recognize predatory behavior. If sharing my story could help even one person avoid what Sarah went through, it was worth it. The prosecution team, led by Catherine Mendez, had built a case so comprehensive it was almost beautiful in its completeness. 3 murders, detailed documentation of intent, DNA evidence, financial records, victim testimony, accomplice testimony from David Brenner, who'd taken a plea deal and would testify against Chris in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sarah and I sat in the front row of the gallery. She'd been in therapy twice a week since the arrest, working through the trauma, rebuilding her sense of self. She was stronger now, steadier. The frightened woman I'd watched walk down the aisle had been replaced by someone who understood she'd survived something terrible and was determined to help put her attacker away. The jury selection took 3 days, 12 ordinary people who would decide Christopher Daniel Richmond's fate. I watched them carefully as they were seated: a retired teacher, a construction worker, a small business owner, people who understood that evil sometimes wore a charming smile. Chris looked different than he had at the preliminary hearing. His lawyer had clearly coached him on appearance: clean-shaven, neat hair, a conservative suit that made him look professional, harmless. But when his eyes swept the courtroom and landed on me, I saw the hatred there, raw and undisguised. The trial itself was methodical and devastating. Mendez presented the case in chronological order, starting with Michelle Thompson in 2019, the victim even we hadn't known about until after Chris's arrest. Michelle's sister testified, describing how Michelle had met a charming man named Daniel Richmond at a real estate conference in Boise, how they'd married after a whirlwind courtship, how Michelle had transferred her property holdings to their joint ownership, how she'd disappeared during a camping trip to Craters of the Moon National Monument. "We thought it was an accident," Michelle's sister said, tears streaming down her face. "The park rangers searched for days. They never found her. And Daniel, Chris, he played the grieving husband so perfectly. We never suspected." Then came Jessica Lynch's family. Her mother, Dorothy Fillingham, took the stand with quiet dignity. She described Jessica's life, her success as a realtor, her generous heart, how Chris, using the name Christopher Parker, had swept her off her feet, how Jessica had been so happy, so in love. "She transferred the house to joint ownership 3 months after the wedding," Dorothy said. "She told me it was what couples did, that it showed trust. 2 weeks later, she went hiking in the Columbia River Gorge with Chris. She never came home." Dorothy's voice cracked. "We buried an empty casket. We didn't have a body to lay to rest. For 4 years, I didn't know what had happened to my daughter. I just knew she was gone, and the man she'd married had somehow profited from her death." Then Mendez showed the jury the photographs, Jessica's remains, found in a shallow grave in Willamette National Forest, the forensic evidence, Chris's DNA under her fingernails where she'd fought back, the injuries consistent with being pushed from a height, then moved and buried. The jury looked sick. 2 of them were crying. Chris sat stone-faced at the defense table, but I saw his jaw tightening, his hands clenching. Amanda West's mother testified next via video link. She was too ill to travel. She described the same pattern: the whirlwind romance, the quick marriage, the property transfer, the hiking trip Amanda never returned from. "I told the police something was wrong," she said, her voice thin and tired. "I told them my daughter wouldn't just disappear, but they said adults have the right to leave their lives behind. They treated it like she'd run away." And Chris played the devastated husband so well, showing them text messages about how she'd been unhappy, how she'd talked about starting over somewhere new. All lies, all fabricated, and they believed him. Then came David Brenner, Chris's accomplice and real estate lawyer. He'd taken a plea deal, 20 years in exchange for full testimony. He looked diminished on the stand, a small man who'd enabled a monster for profit. Brenner detailed the entire operation, how Chris had contacted him after Jessica's disappearance, needing help liquidating her properties quickly. How Brenner had realized something was wrong, but convinced himself it wasn't his business. How he'd helped again with Amanda's properties. How the fees had been too good to refuse. "Did you suspect Christopher Richmond was murdering these women?" Mendez asked. Brenner's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." "But you helped him anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because," Brenner swallowed hard, "because I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I was just a lawyer doing paperwork, that if I didn't help, someone else would. I told myself a lot of things so I could sleep at night. I was wrong. I was a coward, and 3 women are dead because I valued money over doing the right thing." The defense had no effective cross-examination. Weinberg tried to paint Brenner as unreliable, but the financial records backed up every claim. The GPS coordinates in Chris's files matched the locations where Michelle and Jessica had been hiking. The timeline was perfect. The pattern was undeniable. Then it was Sarah's turn to testify. She walked to the stand with her head high, and I'd never been more proud of her. She swore the oath, sat down, and looked directly at Chris. He tried to stare her down, but she didn't flinch. Mendez took her through the entire relationship, the initial charm, the gradual isolation, the control, the threats. "Did the defendant ever threaten you explicitly?" Mendez asked. "Yes," Sarah said clearly. "Multiple times in the last 3 months before the wedding. He'd say things like, 'You wouldn't want to end up like the others.' When I asked what he meant, he'd laugh and say he was joking, but his eyes weren't joking. They were cold." "Did he ever describe how he could hurt you?" "Yes. He showed me articles about women who disappeared on hiking trips, about how their bodies were never found, about how these things happen all the time. Accidents, people slipping, falling. He said, 'It's surprisingly easy to make someone disappear if you know what you're doing.'" "What did you think he meant?" "At first I thought he was trying to scare me into staying with him, trying to control me." Sarah's voice strengthened. "But then I found documents he'd hidden in our apartment, property transfer paperwork with my father's signature forged, plans for a honeymoon hiking trip to Fallen Leaf Lake, and I realized he wasn't just trying to control me. He was planning to kill me." "What did you do?" "I wrote a note and hid it in my wedding bouquet. I knew my father would be watching. I knew if I could just get him that note, he'd save me." "Why didn't you just leave? Call the police yourself?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because Chris said if I told anyone, if I tried to leave, he'd kill me immediately. He said he had ways. That nobody would believe me anyway because everyone thought he was perfect, and he'd isolated me so completely that I believed him. I thought my only chance was to trust my father." When Sarah finished testifying, she walked back to her seat beside me. I squeezed her hand. She'd been magnificent. The defense's case lasted exactly 1 day. Weinberg called character witnesses who described Chris as kind, generous, devoted. But under cross-examination, Mendez demolished them. Had they known Chris kept encrypted files detailing murder plans? Had they seen his financial records showing profit from dead women's estates? Had they known his real name was Christopher Daniel Richmond, not Chris Parker? One by one, they admitted they hadn't known any of it. They'd only seen the mask he wore. Chris himself didn't testify. Weinberg knew putting him on the stand would be suicide. Mendez would eviscerate him with his own encrypted files, his own recorded words, his own DNA at crime scenes. The closing arguments were powerful. Mendez walked the jury through the complete picture. 3 women, 3 identical patterns, 3 murders, all connected by one man's greed and callousness. "Christopher Richmond is a predator," she said, facing the jury. "He selects vulnerable women. He charms them. He marries them. He gets access to their assets. And then he murders them in ways designed to look like accidents. He's done it at least 3 times that we know of. He was preparing to do it a 4th time with Sarah Harris. The only thing that stopped him was a father's intuition and a daughter's courage." She turned to look at Chris. "The defendant is dangerous. He's calculating. He's remorseless, and he must be stopped." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were grim. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Horton asked. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with gray hair, stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Michelle Thompson, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Jessica Lynch?" "Guilty." "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Amanda West?" "Guilty." The verdicts continued. "Guilty on all counts of fraud. Guilty on attempted murder. Guilty on conspiracy. Guilty, guilty, guilty." Chris sat frozen at the defense table. His face had gone chalk white. His mouth hung slightly open. As the verdicts piled up, I watched his composure crack. His hands started shaking. His breathing grew rapid. When the foreman sat down, Chris turned to look at me, not at Sarah, at me, and in that moment, he finally understood. The old fool he'd tried to con had destroyed him completely. The house he'd coveted, the money he'd counted, the future he'd planned, all of it gone, replaced by a cell and 3 consecutive life sentences. I held his gaze, and I smiled. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Chris had lost weight in jail, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. But the hatred in his eyes burned brighter than ever. Judge Horton reviewed the verdicts, then asked if Chris had anything to say before sentencing. Chris stood, his lawyer trying to pull him back down. "This is all a lie," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't kill anyone. I love those women. I love Sarah. That old man destroyed my life because he couldn't let his daughter go. Everything I built, everything I worked for." Judge Horton's voice cut through. "Mr. Richmond, the jury found that what you built was a career of murder and fraud. Do you have anything to say to the victims' families? Any remorse? Any accountability?" Chris was silent. I thought not. Judge Horton's expression was ice. "Christopher Daniel Richmond, you are the most calculating killer I've encountered in 30 years on the bench. You targeted vulnerable women, exploited their trust, stole their assets, and murdered them with premeditation and planning. You left 3 families without closure for years. You showed no remorse then and show none now." She leaned forward. "For the murder of Michelle Thompson, I sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Jessica Lynch, life without parole, to run consecutively. For the murder of Amanda West, life without parole, to run consecutively. For the attempted murder of Sarah Harris and the multiple fraud charges, an additional 50 years, also consecutive." Chris's knees buckled. A bailiff caught him before he fell. "You will die in prison, Mr. Richmond," Judge Horton said, "and the world will be safer for it. Bailiffs, remove the defendant." As they dragged Chris toward the door, he looked back at me one final time. His face was twisted with rage and despair. His mouth moved, forming words, probably more threats, more accusations, but I couldn't hear them over the sound of Dorothy Fillingham sobbing with relief behind me. Chris disappeared through the door. I would never see him again. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us, but Agent Scott and local police cleared a path. Sarah and I made it to Scott's car, and she drove us back to Lake Tahoe. "The FBI wants to formally thank you," Scott said during the drive. "Your cooperation led to the arrest and conviction of a serial killer. You saved your daughter's life and gave closure to 3 other families. That's not nothing, Mr. Harris." "I just did what any father would do," I said. "No," Scott replied. "Most fathers wouldn't have seen the signs, wouldn't have trusted their instincts, wouldn't have had the patience to build a case instead of confronting him directly. You did something remarkable." The weeks after the trial were strange. Life slowly returned to normal, but everything was different. Sarah moved back in with me temporarily while she processed everything, started fresh. We spent our days reclaiming the house from Chris's memory. The guest room where he'd stayed became my new photography studio. We repainted it, replaced the furniture, hung pictures of Lake Tahoe's mountains and forests. Every trace of him was erased. One evening we sat on the dock behind the house, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. It was the same view I'd looked at the night he'd presumed to say he and Sarah would move in. But now it was ours again, just ours. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, "how did you know? Really? When did you figure out what he was?" I thought about the question carefully. I didn't figure it out all at once. It was small things that didn't add up. The way he looked at the house, like he already owned it. The questions about property and wills. The slip about moving in when we'd never discussed it. None of those things alone were proof, but together, they painted a picture. But lots of people are interested in their partner's family finances. That doesn't make them killers. No, I agreed. But then I overheard that phone call. The plan's working perfectly. By the end of the year, everything will be mine. That's when I knew something was very wrong, not just greedy, something dangerous. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I feel so stupid. I didn't see any of it. You're not stupid. He was good at what he did. He'd practiced on 3 other women. He knew exactly how to isolate you, control you, make you doubt yourself. I turned to face her. But you did something incredibly brave. When it mattered most, when you were standing at that altar, you found a way to ask for help. That note saved your life, Sarah. She leaned against my shoulder. I was so scared. I thought if I tried to leave, he'd kill me that night. The wedding felt like my only chance. All those witnesses, you right there in the front row. I hoped you'd understand, that you'd know what to do. I did understand. The moment I read that note, everything clicked into place, and I already had the FBI positioned. We were ready. What if I hadn't written the note? What if I'd been too scared? Then I would have stood up anyway, I said. The FBI and I had planned to stop the wedding no matter what. But your note, it made it perfect. It was your voice, your choice, your courage, not just me imposing my will. And we sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. The mountains across the lake turned purple, then black. Stars began to appear. Dorothy Fillingham came to see me, Sarah said. Jessica's mother. She brought pictures of Jessica, showed me what she looked like, told me about her life. She said, Sarah's voice caught, she said Jessica would have wanted me to live fully, to not let fear win. Wise advice. She said you saved me, that she wished someone had saved Jessica. I wish I could have saved Jessica too, and Michelle, and Amanda. But I can't change the past. I can only protect the people I love in the present. Sarah kissed my cheek. You did that. You protected me. You saved me. And you made sure Chris can never hurt anyone else. Several days later, a letter arrived from the FBI. It was a formal commendation thanking me for my crucial assistance in the apprehension and conviction of Christopher Daniel Richmond. They noted that my actions had directly prevented a 4th murder and provided justice for 3 previous victims. I framed it and hung it in my office, not out of pride, but as a reminder. Evil sometimes wears a charming smile, but vigilance, patience, and a father's love could defeat it. Sarah eventually moved back to her own apartment, but she visited often. We hiked together around Lake Tahoe, reclaiming the trails Chris had tried to turn into hunting grounds. We took photographs of the mountains, the forests, the pristine beauty of our home. One afternoon, I took a small bronze plaque to a quiet spot near the shore, a place where the water was calm and the view stretched endlessly. I'd had it engraved with 3 names, Michelle Thompson, Jessica Lynch, Amanda West. Beneath their names, a simple phrase, remembered, justice served. I set it on a flat rock where the morning sun would touch it, where anyone walking past might pause and wonder about the women whose names were etched there. They'd been victims, but they would also be remembered. As I stood up, I heard footsteps behind me. Sarah had followed me down from the house. She looked at the plaque, then at me, tears streaming down her face. They didn't get justice when they were alive, she said. But because of you, they got it in the end. We got it, I corrected. You, me, the FBI, their families. Justice isn't one person's work. It's everyone who refuses to look away. We walked back to the house together, father and daughter, survivors of a predator who'd underestimated both of us. Christopher Daniel Richmond was in a federal prison, facing 3 consecutive life sentences. He'd never breathe free air again, never charm another victim, never count another dollar stolen from a dead woman's estate. My $2.8 million house remained mine. My daughter remained alive, and Lake Tahoe remained the paradise it had always been, but now we appreciated it in a way we never had before. Sarah was rediscovering joy, dating again carefully and with her eyes open, building a life free from fear. And I was there, watching over her, not with paranoia, but with the calm confidence of someone who'd faced evil and won. Some nights, I stood on my deck with a glass of scotch, looking out at the lake, and thought about how differently things could have ended. But they hadn't. We'd survived. We'd won. Chris had called me an old fool, a vengeful father, someone to be easily manipulated and discarded. He'd been wrong about all of it. Justice had prevailed. And that made all the difference. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.